August 19, 1944, East Prussia. Inside the cold stone walls of Wehrmacht headquarters, General Oberst Alfred Jodl studied the latest intelligence from the Western Front. The numbers were grim for Germany, but also, he believed, hopeful. The Americans had advanced hundreds of miles from the Normandy beaches, driving across France faster than any army in modern history. But Jodl knew the mathematics of war. No army, he reasoned, could move that fast for long. On his desk lay the reports. Patton's Third Army, 12 divisions strong, had outrun its supply lines by nearly 400 miles. An armored division consumed 150,000 gallons of fuel every day during an advance. The Americans' tanks, their trucks, their jeeps, all ran on gasoline. And gasoline had limits. Jodl leaned back, confident in his calculations. They'll halt within days, he told his staff. Perhaps hours. No army in history sustained such speed without fuel. It was a conclusion that echoed across the German general staff. What Jodl didn't know, what no German officer yet grasped, was that even as he spoke, more than 5,900 trucks were already rolling eastward through the night. Headlights blazing, engines roaring, they defied every rule of military caution. From the beaches of Normandy to the fields of northern France, an unbroken convoy was forming, carrying 12,500 tons of supplies every 24 hours. Its name would soon become legend, the Red Ball Express. For all its brilliance, the German army had long been haunted by logistics. They had revolutionized warfare with Blitzkrieg, the lightning war, combining tanks, infantry, and air power into devastating assaults. But even the lightning needed fuel. And time and again, from Poland to Russia, from North Africa to Normandy, German offensives had stalled not from enemy fire, but from empty fuel drums and broken trucks. In the vast expanses of the Soviet Union, their mechanized spearheads had raced too far, too fast. Their trucks bogged down in mud. Rail lines couldn't keep up. The differences in track gauge between Germany and Russia meant supplies piled up hundreds of miles behind the front. 80% of the Wehrmacht's transport was still horse-drawn in 1944. That was the hidden truth behind Hitler's mechanized army, a modern war machine shackled to 19th-century logistics. To German planners, the Americans were now falling into the same trap. On July 30, 1944, General der Panzertruppen Heinrich von Luttwitz, soon to command the XLVII Panzer Corps, wrote in his field report, "The Americans face the same impossibility we faced in Russia. Their speed will become their weakness. Machines require fuel, parts, and ammunition. They have advanced 400 miles in 30 days. History teaches us what comes next: paralysis." German intelligence officers agreed. They tracked every American gallon of gasoline, every rail movement, every ton of ammunition offloaded from the beaches. A Sherman tank burned half a mile's worth of gasoline per gallon on paved roads, worse cross-country. An infantry division required 700 tons of supplies every day. An armored division needed at least 1,000. Patton commanded 12 divisions. That meant 12,000 tons per day, traveling 400 miles from depots still near the Normandy coast. Even if, they calculated, the Americans had unlimited trucks, which they didn't, and perfect roads, which they didn't, and zero mechanical failures, which was impossible, they could not sustain their advance for more than 2 days. As General Major Siegfried Westphal, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal von Rundstedt, later recalled, "We were certain the Americans had reached their limit. Physical laws could not be violated, not even by American industry." But 125 miles away from Jodl's calculations, an American officer named Lieutenant Colonel Laurent Ayas stood in a requisitioned French chateau near Le Mans. It was August 25, 1944. Patton's tanks were running dry. Around him sat a room full of exhausted logistics officers. The numbers they presented were as bleak as the Germans had predicted. Supply depots were overwhelmed. Fuel trucks couldn't keep pace. Railways were damaged beyond repair. Traditional logistics had collapsed. Ayas looked at his men and made a decision that defied every rule of military planning. "Gentlemen," he said, "we're creating a one-way highway from the beaches to the front. Every truck we can find will move 20 hours out of 24. No stops, no delays. We will deliver 12,500 tons a day, minimum." Someone asked what they would call this insane plan. Ayas smiled. "We'll call it the Red Ball Express," he said, borrowing the term from the American railways, where a Red Ball freight meant express priority above all else. Within 36 hours, the impossible was operational. At dawn on August 26, 1944, engines growled to life across Normandy. Drivers from the 3,916th Quartermaster Truck Company climbed into their GMC CCKW 2.5-ton trucks, deuce and a halves, as they were called. Each was loaded with ammunition, rations, and fuel bound for Patton Spearhead 300 miles away. From the beaches of Cherbourg, 2 one-way routes were established, one for trucks heading east toward the front, and one for empty vehicles returning west. Military police established checkpoints every few miles. Mobile repair units patrolled the roads. Convoys ran with headlights blazing through the night, a direct violation of blackout regulations. Trucks traveled in groups spaced 5 minutes apart, averaging 35 miles an hour. Slower vehicles were ordered off the road. Those that broke down were pushed into ditches. The Germans watching from the hills couldn't believe what they were seeing. On August 28, reconnaissance units of the 116th Panzer Division radioed from their observation posts, continuous vehicle column, headlights visible for 20 kilometers. No blackout discipline. Estimate 1,000 vehicles per hour. Americans have abandoned all caution. To German officers trained in the strict doctrines of concealment and discipline, it looked like madness, suicide. But it wasn't madness. It was volume. Where the Germans prized precision, the Americans overwhelmed problems with sheer numbers. There were 23,000 drivers in the Red Ball Express. Nearly 3/4 were African American soldiers, men who served in segregated units, barred from combat and denied equal rights back home. Now, they were the ones keeping the most famous general in the U.S. Army, George S. Patton, in motion. They painted names on their trucks: Hitler's Hell Haulers, Patton's Blood Bank, Detroit to Berlin Express. They created their own traffic laws. If your truck dropped below 20 miles an hour, you were a roadblock. If you broke down, you got pushed aside, fast. They drove through rain and shellfire, through mud and fog. Some stayed behind the wheel for 72 hours straight. Sergeant Andrew White of the 3,146th Truck Company later said, "We didn't think about sleep. We thought about fuel. If we stopped, Patton stopped. That was all that mattered." In those endless convoys, a quiet pride was born. Men who couldn't eat in the same mess halls as white soldiers back home now found themselves indispensable to victory. Every mile they drove was an act of defiance against Hitler's racism and against their own countries. By the final days of August, German reconnaissance was fixated on the phenomenon. General Lieutenant Edgar Fugtinger of the 21st Panzer Division personally observed the convoys from concealed positions. His report to Army Group B headquarters was blunt: the enemy operates a supply system beyond comprehension. Vehicles pass at 30-second intervals, day and night. They do not hide, they do not disperse. This is not military science. This is mass production applied to warfare. German logistics officers couldn't understand it because American logistics operated on entirely different principles. The US Army didn't assume perfection. It assumed failure and built redundancy into everything. If 20% of trucks broke down, that was already planned for. If bridges collapsed, engineers built detours overnight. If fuel ran short, convoys carried their own tankers. And behind it all stood an industrial base that dwarfed the imagination of German commanders. During the first week of the Red Ball Express, from August 25 to August 31, 89,939 tons of supplies were delivered to the front, an average of 12,848 tons per day. Each truck drove a 686-mile round trip, consuming more than 300,000 gallons of gasoline daily, just to keep the operation itself running. To the Germans, those numbers looked impossible. Surely propaganda. But they were real. And they were accelerating. Within 10 days, 5,958 trucks were making 1.5 trips each day, keeping 5,000 vehicles constantly in motion. When breakdowns occurred, and they did, roughly 1,800 daily, mobile repair teams fixed what they could in 15 minutes or less. Those that couldn't be repaired were cannibalized for parts on the spot. Engines were swapped roadside in under an hour. German engineers, meticulous and precise, would have spent days filling out maintenance forms. The Americans? They just got it running and kept driving. As one captured German colonel later admitted, the Americans did not have logistics. They had movement. They did not maintain order, they maintained momentum. But even that momentum required fuel, rivers of it. The Red Ball Express consumed as much gasoline as it carried. Yet the convoys never ran dry. That was thanks to another marvel the Germans didn't even know existed, Operation Pluto, for pipeline under the ocean. While German analysts assumed all Allied fuel came by ship, British and American engineers had secretly laid underwater pipelines across the English Channel, pumping fuel directly from Britain into France. By September 1944, thousands of gallons flowed daily through hoses stretching under the sea, fueling the very trucks that Germans thought would soon be stranded. To observers like General Major Walter Woulemont, it was unbelievable. The Americans burn more gasoline moving gasoline than we allocate to entire panzer armies. This is not war, it is industrial overflow. The result was unprecedented. An American armored division supplied by the Red Ball Express could advance 40 to 60 miles a day, double the maximum rate German doctrine considered possible. On September 1, 1944, Patton's 4th Armored Division advanced 35 miles in the morning, halted for fuel at noon, and then pushed another 32 miles that afternoon. German commanders refused to believe it at first. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of Blitzkrieg itself, dismissed the reports as propaganda. No armored force can advance 60 miles daily for a week, he wrote. Mechanical failure alone would prevent it. But intercepted American radio chatter confirmed it. And worse, the Americans weren't even bothering to hide their transmissions anymore. They moved so fast that the Germans simply couldn't react in time. As one despairing field report concluded, they do not fear us. They are not limited by supply. They advance faster than we can calculate. By early September, the truth was undeniable. The Germans were witnessing something new, something their military science had never conceived: logistics as a weapon. In the coming weeks, the Red Ball Express would grow beyond anything even its creators imagined. It would become not just the lifeline of Patton's army, but a rolling symbol of American power, ingenuity, and racial contradiction. Its convoys would roar through nights of rain and artillery fire, carrying fuel, food, and ammunition through what German soldiers began to call the endless thunder. And as the Third Army rolled toward Paris, the Germans would learn a lesson they could never unlearn: that wars are not only won by courage and steel, but by trucks. The French countryside was still burning when the Red Ball Express began to hum like an artery of steel. By early September 1944, thousands of American trucks carved through the heart of liberated France, day and night, without pause. The road shook with the sound of engines, a steady thunder rolling east toward the front lines. But this was no ordinary convoy. It was a lifeline moving faster than war itself. As one exhausted driver from the 3142nd Truck Company later said, "We weren't driving trucks. We were driving the war forward." They were hauling everything: fuel, food, ammo, tires, medical supplies, even cigarettes and chocolate bars. If it was needed, it moved. And if it didn't move, men died. To the Germans, the Americans seemed to have discovered a kind of black magic: how to keep an entire mechanized army advancing without pause. But to those inside the Red Ball Express, there was nothing magical about it. It was sweat, exhaustion, and a kind of organized chaos that only Americans could have created: wild, reckless, and unstoppable. From a bird's-eye view, the Red Ball Express looked like madness. Trucks jammed every mile of road from Normandy to the Seine. The convoy was divided into two one-way highways, eastbound up and westbound down routes, marked by Red Bulls painted on road signs. Eastbound, the trucks carried fuel and ammunition to the front. Westbound, they returned empty, sometimes loaded with prisoners, sometimes with wounded men too fragile to endure the frontline hospitals. Each truck carried up to 5 tons of cargo, and the rules were brutal: keep moving. No stops except for breakdowns. No convoys under 15 vehicles. No lights out at night, headlights full. Ignore civilians and side traffic. 20 hours on, 4 hours off. Always. Drivers often joked that they didn't know what day it was anymore. Time blurred into the rhythm of engines and the glow of headlights on broken roads. The trucks rattled through towns barely rebuilt from bombing, past churches with no roofs, through villages that still smelled of gunpowder. Children waved American flags as the convoys thundered by. Old French women pressed flowers into the hands of passing drivers. To them, this wasn't just a supply chain. It was liberation in motion. 3 out of every 4 men driving those trucks were African American. They came from Louisiana, Alabama, Detroit, Philadelphia, from small towns and big cities where segregation still marked the buses and the lunch counters. At home, they weren't allowed to sit beside white soldiers in a diner. But here, on the muddy roads of France, they were the engine of the Allied advance. The 761st, the 3089th, the the 3,180th, the 3,505th. These were the units that never made newspaper headlines, but without them, Patton's tanks would have sat silent in French fields. Private James Shepard of the 3,948th Truck Company once told a reporter after the war, "We had one job, feed the front. Didn't matter if it was raining, snowing, or shelling. If Patton was moving, we were moving." Each driver carried a sidearm, a wrench, and a cigarette. They often drove alone through enemy territory, following maps that changed daily. German snipers targeted the convoys. So did Luftwaffe aircraft in low strafing runs. But more trucks kept coming. Always more. General George S. Patton didn't just rely on the Red Ball Express, he obsessed over it. His entire strategy depended on speed, and speed required fuel. On August 31, 1944, Patton wrote in his field diary, "My men can eat their belts, but my tanks have to have gas." By early September, his Third Army was burning 350,000 gallons of fuel a day. When deliveries faltered, Patton himself personally telephoned the logistics officers in charge of the convoys. "I don't care how you do it," he growled. "Beg, borrow, or steal, just get me gas." It wasn't an exaggeration. Patton once threatened to commandeer British fuel reserves without permission, causing a near diplomatic crisis. But that was Patton, relentless, impatient, and unyielding. He saw in the Red Ball Express a reflection of his own philosophy, audacity, momentum, and motion. When a colonel told him that the Red Ball trucks couldn't maintain such a pace for long, Patton reportedly barked, "Then replace the trucks. But don't you ever stop them." To him, logistics wasn't a support function, it was the battlefield. By the second week of operations, fatigue had become a silent enemy. Drivers slept in their trucks, often parked at the side of the road for a few precious minutes before orders to roll again. Meals were canned rations, eaten on the move. Trucks broke down constantly from overuse, transmissions grinding, tires shredded by gravel and debris. Yet morale stayed high. In letters home, soldiers wrote about the pride of being part of something bigger than themselves. "Every mile we drive is a mile closer to Berlin," one driver wrote. But not all made it home. Road accidents were common. Trucks rolled off embankments in the dark. Bridges collapsed under the weight of constant traffic. Enemy aircraft occasionally strafed the convoys, and when that happened, drivers simply gunned their engines and kept going. In one documented case, a driver from the 3,908th Truck Company refused to abandon his vehicle as German planes attacked. He was later found dead in his seat, hand still gripping the wheel, foot still on the accelerator. For every mile of fuel Patton received, another man risked his life to deliver it. By mid-September, German field commanders were desperate for an explanation. How could an army move with such ferocity, such endless energy? In Berlin, Generaloberst Franz Halder reviewed intercepted communications and reconnaissance reports. His conclusion was grim: the Americans have achieved total motorization. They are not constrained by logistics, only by terrain. But the truth was stranger still. The Americans weren't defying logistics. They were redefining it. The German army, for all its discipline and training, was still bound to the past, dependent on railways, horse-drawn wagons, and rigid supply lines. The Americans had turned every truck into a moving supply depot. Their convoys were living systems, adaptable, flexible, and above all, redundant. If one route was bombed, they made another. If a bridge fell, engineers built a new one overnight. To German staff officers, this seemed illogical, even suicidal. As one intelligence summary from Army Group B put it, "They drive like madmen, without rest or order. Yet somehow, they do not collapse." It is the strangest form of organization we have encountered. Even Field Marshal Model, the so-called Führer's fireman, shook his head in disbelief. They fight a war of engines. We fight a war of attrition. It cannot be sustained, and yet it is. The German General Staff had been raised on precision, every movement calculated, every ton accounted for. Their logistics officers viewed war as an equation, inputs and outputs, like the flow of a machine. But the Americans? They treated war like an industry. If one truck broke, they replaced it. If a driver fell asleep at the wheel, another took his place. If a road became impassable, they built a new one. They didn't aim for perfection, they aimed for motion. This difference, invisible on the battlefield, became decisive behind the lines. Where Germany sought order, America embraced productive chaos. And that chaos, powered by Detroit's factories, by African-American drivers, by gasoline and grit, kept Patton's divisions rolling eastward. By the time German intelligence realized what was happening, the Third Army had already reached the Moselle River. But miracles have limits. By late September, the Red Ball Express was running beyond capacity. Roads were collapsing from overuse. Tire shortages became critical. Mechanics were patching vehicles with whatever they could find: rope, tape, scavenged metal. And the men? They were exhausted beyond reason. A field report from the 3,486th Truck Company recorded that some drivers had gone 11 days without a full night's sleep. The weather turned colder, the rain heavier. Mud swallowed trucks whole. Still, the orders didn't stop. Every morning, dispatchers shouted destinations: Verdun, Reims, Metz. Names etched in blood from the last war, now revived for another. Even when trucks were destroyed, the convoys kept rolling. As one officer put it, we measured success not by what arrived, but by how little stopped. Few generals wrote songs about the Red Ball Express. Few medals were awarded. Yet, as Eisenhower himself later admitted, the operation was the lifeline of our armies. Without it, Patton's Blitz would have died in the fields of France. The irony was profound. The men who were least celebrated, the truck drivers, the mechanics, the fuel handlers, were the ones who turned the tide of Europe's largest land campaign. A segregated force, fighting for a freedom they didn't fully share at home, had made history move. When Paris was liberated on August 25, it was their convoys that brought the champagne and the bread, the ammunition and the gasoline, that allowed the celebration to happen. One French villager later said, "We saw the tanks of Patton, but before them came the thunder, the sound of the Red Ball." Weeks earlier, German generals had laughed at American logistics, certain the advance would stall, that no army could outrun its own fuel. But by autumn of 1944, the laughter had gone silent. Every day, new convoys rolled east, swallowing the map of France, pushing the front closer to the German border. The Wehrmacht, once the master of movement, was now the hunted, crippled by fuel shortages, cornered by an enemy whose strength came not just from bravery, but from bounty. In the quiet of his bunker, General Jodl reread his earlier prediction. He no longer smiled. The Red Ball Express had rewritten the laws of war, and it was only getting faster. By September of 1944, the Red Ball Express was no longer a supply route. It was a river, wide, relentless, unstoppable. Across the French countryside, every major road east of Normandy throbbed with motion. Engines coughed, gears screamed, and thousands of trucks churned up dust that hung over the landscape like a storm cloud. From the hedgerows of Saint-Lô to the bombed ruins of Reims, the Red Ball never slept. Every 20 seconds, a truck passed a checkpoint: fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts, boots, and even mail. The American front was consuming supplies faster than history had ever seen. And yet, somehow, the flow never stopped. At its height, the Red Ball Express delivered over 140,000 tons of supplies every week. To the German soldiers still fighting desperate rearguard actions, the sight of the endless convoys became a nightmare. They called it Die Rollend Fabrik, the rolling factory. The joke among weary American drivers was simpler: Hitler can't stop what he can't catch. But beneath the thunder of engines, cracks were beginning to show, not in courage, but in the strain of keeping an entire army alive on the move. By mid-September, the Allied advance had slowed, not because of resistance, but because the front had outrun its supply lines. Patton's tanks were less than 60 miles from the German border. Eisenhower wanted to press on, to end the war before winter. But wars don't end on courage alone. They end when the fuel drums run dry. At this stage, 1 in every 10 gallons of fuel brought across the Atlantic was being burned just to deliver the other 9. A logistical paradox: the Red Ball Express was consuming itself to stay alive. Colonel Loren Ayers, the man who'd helped launch the operation, noted grimly in his field report, "Our biggest problem is not fuel for the front, but fuel for the trucks delivering it." Still, the mission continued. Every hour lost meant more tanks stranded, more opportunities for the Germans to regroup behind the Siegfried Line. So the order from headquarters was simple: keep moving, no matter the cost. To the men behind the wheel, life was a blur of motion. Private Leonard Brooks of the 3,496th Truck Company recalled, "You didn't know what day it was. You drove until your eyes burned, until you couldn't tell if it was dawn or dusk." The road never stopped. Convoy leaders rode armed, not against Germans, but against fatigue. Drivers fell asleep mid-journey, drifting across lanes, sometimes smashing into ditches or other trucks. A standing rule emerged among the men: if your buddy's truck goes off the road, you honk once and keep going. The cargo couldn't stop. Not for anyone. They sang songs to stay awake, blues, gospel, swing, the music echoing off the canvas-covered beds of their trucks. And when exhaustion hit too hard, they'd pull over, splash their faces with cold gasoline from the drums, and get back behind the wheel. Behind every convoy was an invisible army of mechanics and dispatchers. Mobile repair depots dotted the route, men working knee-deep in mud, replacing axles, engines, and tires by hand. Some did 30 repairs a night under the flicker of lanterns. They joked that their motto should have been repair it or roll it into the ditch. Dispatchers, meanwhile, managed chaos on a scale never attempted before. Thousands of trucks from dozens of companies had to be synchronized like clockwork, all moving through French towns still littered with rubble. It was logistics turned into art, crude, loud, and brilliant. Sergeant Henry Barnes, a Red Bull dispatcher, later said, "It wasn't organization. It was improvisation, American style. When things broke, we didn't fix the plan. We fixed the truck." That philosophy, improvisation over perfection, was what made the Red Bull Express unstoppable. But the Germans were watching. By late September, Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights began targeting Red Bull routes. Fighter bombers strafed convoys in daylight, forcing drivers to weave between craters and burning wrecks. The 3,447th Truck Company lost 9 men in a single day to enemy air attacks near Chartres. In response, the Americans armed their trucks with .50 caliber machine guns scavenged from wrecked tanks. Crews began painting slogans on the sides of their vehicles, "Hit me if you can" and "Patton's gasoline delivery." When the Luftwaffe dove, drivers simply pressed harder on the accelerator. If one truck was destroyed, another took its place within the hour. To the Germans, it was madness. To the Americans, it was momentum. A captured German officer later admitted under interrogation, "We stopped tanks with artillery. But we could not stop their trucks. They were like ants, endless, fearless, everywhere." At the operations peak in late September, more than 6,000 trucks were in motion every single day. Each carried 5 tons, adding up to a staggering 30,000 tons daily. Fuel, food, spare parts, rations, medical supplies, artillery shells, all flowing like a living organism. To compare, Germany's entire Western Front supply capacity at the same time barely reached 10,000 tons per day, and much of that was dependent on failing rail networks bombed by Allied aircraft. The Red Bull Express was not just keeping up, it was overwhelming the very concept of logistical limitation. This was the moment when Germany's industrial logic finally broke. For every hour the Americans moved forward, the Germans fell back. Their tanks were stranded, their trucks abandoned, their horses dying in the fields from exhaustion. The Wehrmacht's lightning warp had been outpaced by something faster, industrial war. The men of the Red Bull Express began to understand that they weren't just driving supplies, they were driving destiny. They created their own brotherhood, a shared language and culture born on the road. They called each other wheelmen, grease monkeys, and convoy kings. They carved dice into dashboards for luck. They swapped spare tires like currency. And despite the segregation that defined the US Army, the Red Bull's roads blurred those lines. Under fire, skin color didn't matter, what mattered was keeping the trucks moving. One white sergeant from the 3,928th Truck Company later said in an interview, "On that road, there were no white or colored. There were just drivers. If your buddy's truck was burning, you pulled him out. That was it." It was a quiet revolution rolling through France, an unspoken unity forged in diesel smoke and shared danger. By late autumn, the Red Bull Express was showing its age. Engines were blowing out from overuse. Tires shredded faster than replacements could arrive. Bridges collapsed under the constant pounding of 6-ton trucks. The convoys were now operating 23 hours a day, and rest camps were filled with men so tired they fell asleep standing. Rain turned roads into rivers of mud. And yet, they kept going. One report from September 24 describes trucks driving through waist-deep water for miles, their engines barely above the flood. Drivers wrapped rags around their faces to breathe through the exhaust fumes. Still, every morning, new orders arrived, supplies to Reims by noon. Fuel to Nancy by sundown. To fail was not an option. As the leaves turned and the first snows fell, Hitler prepared his final counterstroke, the Ardennes offensive. To German commanders, it was one last gamble, a strike through Belgium aimed at splitting the Allied armies. But even this desperate plan depended on fuel. The irony was painful, the Germans hoped to capture Allied gasoline dumps to power their own tanks. By December 1944, they were fighting not for territory, but for American fuel. When Hitler's generals asked how they would sustain the offensive, he told them coldly, "Our tanks will drink the enemy's fuel." Meanwhile, the Red Ball Express, battered, overworked, but still alive, had already stockpiled enough reserves to survive the blow. The same system the Germans had laughed at in August would now become the reason their final offensive collapsed. By November 1944, the Red Ball Express had carried over 400,000 tons of supplies, more than all German rail deliveries to the Western Front combined. It had transformed logistics from a background operation into a decisive weapon. For the first time in history, an army could move hundreds of miles without pause, sustained entirely by mechanized transport. The American soldier no longer fought on hunger or hope, he fought with full magazines, warm food, and gasoline in every tank. And it was all because of a few thousand exhausted men in mud-streaked trucks. When historians later wrote about the liberation of Europe, they spoke of Normandy, of Paris, of Bastogne. But the Red Ball Express rarely earned a headline. Its drivers received few medals. Most returned home to quiet towns where no one knew what they'd done. Yet Eisenhower would later say in 1945, "No army in history ever advanced as fast or as far as ours did in France, and no army ever could have without the Red Ball Express." The German generals who once laughed at American logistics now sat behind barbed wire, defeated not just by bullets, but by trucks, by the very thing they believed would fail. In the end, it wasn't strategy that broke the Third Reich. It was motion. It was fuel. It was the sound of 10,000 engines roaring through the night, a sound that told the world that freedom was on the move. By late November 1944, the rain had turned the French countryside into an ocean of mud. The once dusty trails of the Red Ball Express were now rivers of sludge. Trucks sank up to their axles, engines screaming, tires spinning helplessly in the muck. And still, they rolled on. The war was entering its final phase. The German army, blooded, retreating, desperate, clung to the western border, behind their final defensive wall, the Siegfried Line. Beyond it lay the heart of Germany. Patton, Bradley, Hodges, all were straining at the leash, waiting for one thing: fuel. Gasoline was the blood of the Allied advance. Every drop meant another tank moving east, another artillery battery firing, another step closer to Berlin. But the Red Ball Express, now 5 months into its relentless operation, was showing every scar of its impossible mission. Engines were dying, men were collapsing, and morale, once the pride of the road, was fading under exhaustion. The road that had once symbolized unstoppable progress now felt like a burden carried by ghosts. When the Red Ball Express began in August, it was designed to last 2 weeks. By November, it had run for nearly 100 days without pause. The wear on men and machines was staggering. Trucks that had once been symbols of power, the mighty GMC's Jimmy, the Studebaker, the Dodge WC, were now patched together with wire, rags, and hope. Spare parts were gone. Tires were retreaded until they exploded mid-run. Mechanics cannibalized wrecked vehicles to keep the convoys alive. Private Edward Jackson recalled years later, "We didn't drive trucks anymore. We drove miracles." Every mile was borrowed time. And yet, there was no thought of quitting. Eisenhower's armies were pushing toward the German border, and supplies were still the thin line between victory and paralysis. Each truckload of gasoline, food, and ammunition meant lives saved, or lost, at the front. The physical and emotional strain on Red Ball drivers reached its peak that winter. Men averaged 4 hours of sleep per day. Some went 72 hours without rest. They drove through snow, fog, and shellfire. They ate cold rations from tin cans while steering one-handed through icy turns. And the accidents multiplied. On one bitter night near Metz, a truck skidded on black ice and plunged off a bridge into the Moselle River. The driver, a 19-year-old from Georgia named Corporal Louis Tucker, drowned still gripping the steering wheel. His body was recovered days later, frozen to the seat. Another convoy was caught in an ambush by German stragglers outside Nancy. 3 trucks were destroyed, but the remaining drivers fought back with carbines and grenades, defending not soldiers or tanks, but gasoline. To the men who survived, there was no question what they were fighting for. If Patton runs out of gas, one driver said, "We all die a little slower." Despite segregation laws still governing the US Army, the Red Ball Express became an accidental experiment in equality. Over 75% of its drivers were African American. These were men who, by official policy, were not allowed to fight on the front lines. But on the Red Ball routes, they faced equal danger, from exhaustion, ambush, and the relentless march of time. In the chaos of the convoys, race disappeared. Sergeant Raymond Jordan later said, "On the road, nobody cared what color you were. If your truck broke down, you were a brother, and brothers helped each other." White officers began to recognize what Washington had refused to see, that these men were not just laborious, but heroes. When Patton visited a Red Bull depot near Verdun, he watched a line of black drivers unloading gasoline drums in freezing rain. He turned to his aide and said simply, "Without these boys, my tanks don't move an inch." It was the first time in U.S. Army history that African American drivers had earned direct commendations from field generals. They didn't just keep the war moving, they changed the way the Army saw itself. September's daring airborne gamble, Operation Market Garden, had exposed the fragility of Allied logistics. When the plan faltered in the Netherlands, it was the Red Bull Express that had to rescue stranded paratroopers and resupply the collapsing advance. Trucks raced north through destroyed bridges and minefields, pushing to deliver ammunition to the 82nd and 101st Airborne. One convoy ran for 48 hours straight without rest, delivering fuel just in time to keep British tanks from running dry under German counterattack. Though the operation failed strategically, the Red Bull's effort prevented a disaster from becoming a catastrophe. It was a brutal lesson: no matter how daring the strategy, the war still belonged to the men who could keep the engines running. By December 1944, snow blanketed northern France. Trucks chained their tires, headlights dimmed to slits against the blizzard. The cold turned fuel into syrup and oil into sludge. The Red Bull Express was nearing its end, not because it had failed, but because it had succeeded too well. The Allies had finally repaired enough railroads to take over the burden of supply. The trucks had done their job. But before they could rest, one last challenge arose: Hitler's final throw of the dice, the Battle of the Bulge. In December 1944, the Ardennes forest erupted. German panzers smashed into thin Allied lines, sending chaos through Belgium and Luxembourg. For days, no one knew how far the Germans had penetrated. American units were surrounded, cut off, desperate for supplies, for fuel, for anything that could keep them alive. Once again, it was the truck drivers of the Red Bull Express who answered. They loaded their rigs in the dark, headlights blacked out, and drove directly into combat zones. Convoys slipped through artillery fire and blizzards to reach encircled units. Some trucks were destroyed by enemy fire, others captured, but most made it through. In one case, a convoy of 20 trucks brought fuel to the 7th Armored Division just as their tanks ran dry near Saint-Vith. The moment they arrived, those same tanks roared back to life, blasting through German lines in a counterattack that helped turn the tide. When the battle finally ended, the Red Bull drivers returned to their bases in silence. They had saved armies, again, without medals, without parades. On November 16, 1944, the Red Bull Express was officially discontinued as the main supply route. But the men didn't stop. The convoys continued under different names: the White Bull, the Green Diamond, the XYZ route, smaller systems feeding the final push into Germany. The name Red Bull Express faded from the orders, but not from memory. In just 3 months of official operation, it had transported over 412,000 tons of supplies, enough to build an entire city from scratch. It was the greatest logistical achievement in U.S. Army history, built on speed, sacrifice, and the quiet courage of men most Americans would never hear of. The lessons of the Red Bull Express would outlive the war itself. The U.S. Army's logistical doctrine was rewritten to mirror its success: mobile depots, forward repair stations, and driver-based autonomy. When Korea broke out in 1950, and later Vietnam, the same principles applied: the road was as powerful as the gun. Even NATO's modern rapid response logistics trace their roots to that French highway network, born out of desperation, perfected through courage. And beyond tactics, the Red Bull Express left a deeper legacy. It challenged segregation, forced respect, and proved that discipline and brotherhood could transcend prejudice. General Dwight D. Eisenhower would later write in his memoirs, "The Red Bull Express was the lifeline of our army. It was built by men who refused to quit, and their story deserves to stand beside any victory we ever won." When the war ended, the convoys vanished almost overnight. Trucks were scrapped or sold to French farmers. The signs marking Red Bull route were taken down, forgotten under weeds and dust. The drivers returned home, to Louisiana, Georgia, Michigan, New York, their uniforms traded for work shirts, their stories left untold. No medals, no monuments. Just the memory of headlights cutting through the dark, engines humming like a heartbeat under the stars. Decades later, a few veterans returned to France. They stood on those same roads, now silent and overgrown. One of them, James Williams of the 3640th Truck Company, placed his hand on the cracked asphalt and said softly, "We carried the war on our backs, and then we disappeared." In the end, the German generals had been right about one thing: logistics would decide the war. They were simply wrong about who would master it. What began as a desperate improvisation became a triumph of will and ingenuity, a victory not of generals, but of drivers. While tanks and infantry took the glory, it was the roar of engines on forgotten roads that truly broke the Nazi war machine. The Red Ball Express was more than a convoy. It was the pulse of freedom, echoing across the battered roads of France, a testament to what men can achieve when there's no choice but forward. And as the last truck rolled out, its taillights vanishing into the night, one truth remained clear: the road to victory was paved not with steel or blood, but with courage, wheels, and an unbreakable will to keep moving.